Throughout the stories that compose Christianity's history and its pedigree, we are introduced to the most unlikely cast of characters who are commissioned with the seemingly impossible expectations of God. At best, they are unremarkable, but often they're much less than that, and at the worst, they are completely unqualified and unsuited for what is eventually accomplished through them. And this pattern, this theme runs throughout the Bible and then also through church history. And I wonder how often we all, Christians and skeptics alike, take notice of this pattern and then reflect on its significance. What is common among these individuals is that by any standard we have to measure a person's quality or potential to contribute to society, they would come up short, which is why nobody was giving them positions of authority or commissioning them with great responsibility. David, who is the first great king of Israel, appeared to his contemporaries in this way, and he's introduced to us as the unlikely opponent of the Philistine warrior, the Philistine champion Goliath. And Goliath represents everything we would bet on in a one-on-one duel. He's this towering figure who exhibits all the confidence that would suggest that he's an accomplished warrior. And as we all know, David is victorious, and this is the first step to his eventual ascent to the throne as the king. And this story, this reference of David and Goliath is so iconic to us that we use it as a metaphor for every underdog story that we're aware of. And the Old Testament is full of stories of unlikely heroes. But if you fast forward a little bit to the New Testament, we get an even more exaggerated depiction of the kinds of unlikely people that God chooses to carry out his plans. Jesus picks his 12 apostles who will inherit his divine authority and carry on his mission after he's gone. And who does he pick? Complete nobodies. Again, by every metric we have to measure a person, these guys would fly completely under the radar. Nobody would trust them with anything important, yet for some reason, God does. And while Jesus lives, these guys reinforce every low expectation that we would have of them. They struggle to understand Jesus' teachings. They dispute with each other about who's going to be the greatest in Jesus' new kingdom. And then when Jesus' life is threatened, they run and hide and stay hiding throughout his trial and execution. And Peter, who is supposed to be the first among them, is so incapable of rising to this occasion that he is sent into a hysterical fit of denial when a servant girl accuses him of knowing Jesus. And yet the Goliath that these same apostles had to overcome was the whole unbaptized world. Jesus told them to go and make disciples of all nations, teaching them what he had taught them, and then baptizing them. In other words, they were to spread Christianity throughout the entire known world. They had no political authority, no great wealth, no military might, no great cunning, and no impressive skills. And yet, they were supposed to instigate a cultural and religious revolution that would change the course and character of human history. They were to do what great statesmen, military tacticians, and philosophers like Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar and Marcus Aurelius, William the Conqueror, Saladin, Genghis Khan, and Napoleon couldn't do. Inexplicably, they were successful. And that accomplishment still has scholars and historians today scratching their heads because there is no rational explanation for how or why it happened, at least not one that consensus can be built around unless you admit the possibility that God did it. And then throughout the church's history, there are characters who became conduits for the perpetuation of Christ's kingdom, but had no business being history makers. People like St. Augustine or St. Joan of Arc or St. Juan Diego or the Children of Fatima. So what are the takeaways from the themes that emerge from these stories? Well, I would say that the first is that it tells us something about God, and specifically that God has been actively involved in human history. Because everything we've been taught about how great people accomplish great things, the kinds of great things that are impressive enough that they would get recorded in the history books, is at odds with the stories of these collaborators with God who accomplished great things in spite of everything that suggested that they wouldn't. Again, these people were unremarkable, unqualified, and if we want to be crass about it, they were losers. But it's the fact that they were losers that made it so that God's glory could be most explicitly revealed through them. St. Paul reminds us that it's in our weakness that God's strength can most easily be employed. If God used extraordinary people to instantiate and perpetuate his kingdom, then the perception of his role would become diminished, because we would just look at it and say, well, that's great people doing great things. But when he uses the losers from among us, we look at it and say, well, God must have done that because there's no way he or she could have done that. Next, it teaches us the remarkable potential for what God's grace can do in your life. If he can transform the cowardly St. Peter into the rock upon which his church would be built, into someone who would face down the powers of the Roman Empire and allow his blood to be shed so that it would become the seed that would transform Rome into a Christian empire, imagine what he can do with you. Lastly, I think there's a caution in it, because we may come across people who exhibit remarkable gifts and accomplishments in the church today, but we don't know the whole context of their story. And so we just see the great accomplishments, and so we might treat them with a kind of a claim that is suited to somebody who accomplished all of that on their own. And the risk is that our leaders start to become celebrities, and they can become tempted to believe their own hype. They stop believing that they are simply losers coasting on God's grace, and if they stop believing that, then they will stop depending on God's grace. I think this is the kind of thing that can help us trace the origin of so many of the scandals in the church, because it can be so heartbreaking to find out that someone you looked up to in the faith was actually leading a double life. And I think this is the kind of thing that happens when those people stop depending on God's grace and start to believe that the great accomplishments that have been done through them were their own accomplishments rather than God working through their weaknesses. And then they fall from grace because they stop depending on grace, and then scandal becomes inevitable. So I think there's a lesson for us in the church that when someone from among us starts to do something remarkable, we should recognize God's glory in that. And if that's you, if you're somebody that God has used, then don't forget it and don't start to believe the celebrity and hype that might surround you. You are a loser, and to loserdom you shall return. Thanks so much for watching, guys. If you enjoyed that, then please consider subscribing and liking, and come find me on Facebook and Twitter. It's a huge help when you do that. It helps us get these videos in front of more and more people. And a big thank you goes out to You Catholic for presenting these videos. And if you want to support the making of these videos, then please consider supporting my work as a digital media and marketing expert. My company, Holdsworth Design, specializes in branding, web and graphic design, marketing, social media, videography, and all that kind of good stuff. So if you know of a parish, a diocese, a ministry, or a business that needs help in those areas, then please send them our way, and I'm sure we can help them out.